Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks everybody for coming. Thank you, Professor Trubowitz, for coming in particular. We have a lot to discuss. We'll mostly stick to foreign policy, but we'll also talk about domestic policy. I wanted to begin with the midterms, but before that you just mentioned that you teach a course called American Grand Strategy, which at this particular time I wonder what that is.
Well, maybe over the course of the evening we'll be able to unpack that. First, let me just say I'm very happy to be here. It's great. It's my first visit to the city, and I want to thank the university for inviting me. This is a fantastic hall to do something like this in. I teach this course called American Grand Strategy, and my opening line at the beginning of the term is it's a bit of an oxymoron today. But I actually think, and I'll probably try to argue this over the course of this evening, that there is a pattern to what Donald Trump is doing. And it's, I think it's easy to lose sight of it amidst all the tweets, and there is some erratic behavior as well. But I think when you look at what Trump is doing in the area of trade policy, when you look at what he's doing in the area of security policy and also his approach to international institutions, there are some threads, or there is a thread that ties those things together. And I would say, just as a kind of opening here, that I think what Trump is operating on the assumption that that America's long-standing commitment to liberal internationalism, free trade, open borders, working through international institutions, collective security, no longer pays the kind of dividends for the United States that it once did. And the feeling is that the United States has to renegotiate or redefine its terms of international engagement. And I think he believes that international circumstances are such that the United States has a fair amount of bargaining leverage to be able to change those terms. And I think he also thinks that he has sufficient domestic support to do those kinds of things. And so I think it structures, in a sense, his approach. I'm not saying he's right, and maybe we'll kind of unpack all of that, but it's that there's there's some method, there is some pattern to this, and it's not just Trump, it's other people that either were close to Trump or are still close to Trump that share those views.
Yeah. Is that a belief, because Trump has a lot of, if he does have beliefs, they fluctuate. I think there's one belief that has been consistent for the past decades, and that is we're being, pardon my French, screwed in trade, right? Is that the one consistent belief you see as well?
Yeah, I think he thinks, there's two versions of we're getting screwed, and that is that Europe is fleecing us when it comes to defense spending. So Donald Trump has actually been saying this for 25 years. It's not new. And you can go back to interviews in the early 1990s where he was saying that. And the other thing that he has said for a very long time is that America's trading arrangements and its commitment to free trade is not in America's best interest, that it may have been at one point in time, but that it is no longer, and that American leaders, and I think he doesn't blame international leaders, he blames American leaders, Republican and Democratic, for getting fleeced, where he would never get fleeced because he's such a great, he knows how to make a deal. So. Right.
The art of the deal.
Yeah.
Even though I wouldn't call him a Republican, but he ran for president as a Republican.
Sure.
And the three pillars of the Republican Party for decades have been free trade, open borders, and proactive abroad, spreading democracy, whether or not it's with help of the military, fighting wars. Basically, Trump does away with all these pillars. Yet, both in Congress and the general electorate of the among Republicans, they support him like they've not supported any Republican before. So, does that mean that these three pillars are basically gone forever because you can get support from Republicans by burning the house down?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, so this is a great point, and it is true that Trump has pushed back against some long-held Republican views. I mean, there was a time when the Republicans actually were protectionist, but you got to go back 100 years.
Sure.
So,
but not since Reagan.
But not since Reagan, correct. And I think that that has been a difficult pill for a lot of Republicans to swallow.
The free trade.
The free traders. Not so much with respect to China, but I think there was a great deal of concern both about Trump's position with respect to Canada and Mexico and Europe. And I think those are two areas where we saw Trump actually give some ground. I mean, he certainly has given ground with respect to Europe, or at least put things on hold, let's say. And in the case of Canada and Mexico, he struck a deal. It's not clear that it is a great deal for the United States. He moved the needle a little bit on some issues that are
replacing
important.
NAFTA.
Basically. Yeah, and replacing NAFTA, but it's not a wholesale replacement. And both Mexico and Canada got very important concessions from Trump or Robert Lighthizer, his negotiator. So it wasn't kind of a one-sided deal. I mean, I would say on the question of open borders, the Republican Party has been moving for some time and towards more closed borders or being tough on immigration. And it was Donald Trump that recognized it. You know, people don't know this or remember this, perhaps, about Donald Trump, but after the 2012 election, when Mitt Romney lost to Barack Obama, during the campaign, Romney was pretty hard on Mexicans coming north across the border, and there was some Republicans thought that he was too tough, in part to cover his right flank, his conservative flank, inside the party to deal with a challenge from the right. He went to the right on border issues. And one of the people who criticized him for being too tough on immigrants and immigration was Donald Trump. I kid you not. Trump, I think, did a little bit of research. Some people say like this, and realized that this was an issue that could work for him inside the Republican Party. So I think what he sensed was, well, you're right, in principle, the needle was moving. On the question of projecting American values overseas, kind of democracy promotion, that's, you know, I think also that's a place where Republicans were not 100, I mean, largely because of what happened in Iraq.
In Iraq, right.
That they themselves had misgivings. And, you know, I mean, I personally was struck by it in the 2016 campaign, in 2015, when he was taking on, you know, Jeb Bush and, like, you know, trashing his brother over the Iraq war. I mean, it was really quite stunning that he felt that there was enough support inside the party for doing that. Mm-hmm. And so he went against, you know, in a very clear and as he would say, a strong way, against that position. But I think there's a larger point in what you've said is Donald Trump owns the Republican Party right now. And rank and file Republicans are very nervous about being on the wrong side of him. And the reason that they're worried about it is not because of the Democrats. They're worried about what we call getting primaried. It's a kind of new verb in the United States, and it means that before the general election, there are primaries within each one of the party to determine who the different candidates are. And what Republicans are concerned about is a challenge from their right, not from their left and not the Democrats. They're worried about somebody arguing that they're not tough enough on the border, that they're not conservative enough when it comes to Supreme Court judges, that they're not tough enough, or they're not supportive enough of the right to own guns.
So that also means that the Republicans in Washington are a lot less to the right than the general base of the Republican Party.
I think that that's probably true,
right.
And or that there's at least a bit more spread inside the Republican Party. And I think we saw that in the midterms, actually, where a lot of suburban voters, especially suburban women voters, for the first time in some time, voted against the party, voted against Republicans. And that's why the Democrats did so well in the midterms, or one of the main reasons is that suburban voters who normally line up behind a Republican candidate didn't.
Yeah, let's talk about the midterms, because as you're just mentioning, that the Democrats won big in the House. They are about to win their 40th seats.
Correct.
Tonight, I think they were still counting one congressional race, so you can call that a blue wave.
Yes.
In the Senate, obviously, the Republicans held on to their majority, even enlarged it a little bit by 2 or 3 seats. Since we're mostly talking about foreign policy here tonight, the Senate is the place where foreign policy gets built, basically. So even though after the midterms Trump may not be as powerful domestically because he lost the House,
Right.
internationally, and you see that with every midterm where the president, loses in the House but sticks to the Senate, internationally he can do a lot more than he has done over the past few years.
Indeed.
So what will how has this midterms strengthened his hand?
So what I like to say to people, I get asked this question, if you don't have your seatbelts on, buckle up, because I think Donald Trump, Donald Trump wanted the midterms to be about him, and in a sense they really were. And as you suggest, there really was a blue wave. This was not the initial interpretation in Washington and in the American media, but in fact, every day it seems, we sometimes call this the Hanukkah election, not the Christmas election, because every day brings a new gift to the Democrats, a new seat, and they'll probably get this 40th seat, as you suggest. And they're also going to get a speaker. The Democratic speaker is going to be Nancy Pelosi. And this is no wallflower. I mean, she's tough, and she will be every bit Donald Trump's equal.
His nightmare, basically.
What's that?
His worst nightmare.
His worst nightmare. So the point here is, I think what's going to happen to Trump for a few reasons. The reason that losing the House was really important. It is true that they held the Senate. I think, I'll leave that aside for a second. The reason that losing the House is important here is that the House is going now to be able to investigate him and his administration extensively. Partly because Democrats will now be able to avail themselves of a rule that Republicans put into place under Obama. It used to be the case that you couldn't subpoena somebody in an administration unless you had a vote out of the committee, the full committee. The Republicans didn't think that was a good idea, that only the chairman should be able to decide whether or not you can issue a subpoena. Well, as they say, what goes around comes around, and so what's going to be happening is there's going to be a fair amount of investigation. So that's point number one. Is that
everything from his finances to Russia, everything,
exactly, right? and it could be when there's an attempt, when a move to roll back regulations, let's say dealing with the climate, right? Democrats can call now members of the administration up to explain their policy and to grill them and to basically, make it more public, to draw the public in, to draw the media in, to ensure that it gets more scrutiny, that it's not just, these are not just decisions that are made kind of like in the dead of the night. The second thing is that the Democrats are going to push him pretty hard on democratic legislation, on domestic legislation, much of which he's not going to be interested in, and for sure that the Republican Senate is not going to be interested in. It's not to say that there aren't areas where they will find potential agreement, Big pharma is one, cutting drug costs. Another one might be on infrastructure, potentially on trade. But in general, Trump is going to find it to be very tough going domestically. As a result, the only real play he's going to have, I think, is going to be on the foreign policy side. Therefore, what I expect to see over the next 2 years is him investing more time on the foreign policy side. Now, I know sitting over here, it feels like he's always investing time on the foreign policy side. But in fact, this guy's really a domestic policy president first. I mean, that is his principal focus. And I think that that calculation is now going to change.
And what does that mean? Because, as you say, I mean, he has been active with the Paris Accord and cutting the Iran deal. On Cuba, I think we know all the examples. I mean, how much... He has been pretty busy. How much worse can it get?
Well, I mean, you could imagine him saber rattling in certain parts of the world. Mm-hmm. Potentially in the Middle East, with respect to Iran. I think there are issues, problems, concerns, even in the hemisphere. Venezuela comes to mind, and the administration has talked a fair amount about instability in Venezuela and what it might mean for the greater region. But I also think this administration has put now China pretty much kind of front and center on the foreign policy front, and so I would not be surprised to see them ratchet it up. I mean, it's possible that Xi Jinping and Trump cut some deal at the G20. I wouldn't hold my breath, over the next few days. And even if they do come to some temporary agreement, I think kind of the structure of the situation is not good. Yeah.
We'll get to Asia and the Middle East and Europe in a second. I just want to stick to the overall picture of the Trump administration in foreign policy, because right after the election you wrote that personnel is policy, and it's very important to look at his cabinet members. We've seen a few people come and go right now. You have Mattis on defense, you have Pompeo as a Secretary of State, and then John Bolton came in, who is a notorious and he was a notorious neocon, a war hawk, an Iraq war hawk, an Iran hawk. What do you make of the people surrounding Donald Trump right now, and who does he listen to, and what does that mean for the next few years?
I think right now, I mean, he's got, as you suggest, he's got a couple people with very strong views, like Bolton, around him. I think the one that I focus on the most, and perhaps worry the most about, I worry that he might leave, is Mattis. So I think that Mattis was one of a number of people early in the administration who were kind of playing, well, as you just said, defense, and trying to ensure that issues were properly debated, that the president and the national security advisor, but I mean that the president thought through a couple steps, like the potential implications of a decision, that what it might mean for a particular region, and what it might mean in terms of extending American forces or putting them in harm's way and so forth. And I think there's a great deal of concern in Washington right now that Mattis is kind of his days are numbered, that he will either step down himself or actually be forced out, because he's pushed back on a number of issues where and found himself on the opposite side from Bolton. And I think Bolton is a pretty strong voice right now. Now,
where do we notice that?
I think on the Iran issue in particular. So, I mean, I think actually, I don't think many leaders in Brussels or policymakers in Brussels will say this, but certainly not on the record, not on your show, but that in a way Bolton was very helpful at the last summit here, I don't mean the ill-fated trip recently. Well, maybe they're all ill-fated, but the
NATO summit.
The NATO summit, where there were agreements that were set, and they were set actually before Trump ever showed up. And so they were negotiated out, and Bolton was very involved in that. But it's a different story if you happen to be in Tehran or in Beijing.
About that, and we'll go back and forth a bit, but you mentioned NATO, and the deal that was struck is that European countries again commit to paying more for their defense, right?
That deal, but also an understanding that the U.S. was going to bring forces over here and a certain number of additional forces. And so that there was a kind of, it was symbolic in many respects, but a recommitment of, that America has kind of like some skin in the game here.
When it comes about paying for European defense, Trump from the beginning has said NATO countries in Europe should step up to the plate. Wasn't that also an effective strategy in a way? I mean, every president has said that to European nations forever. Obama has said it. It seems like this time, for the first time in years, they actually listen.
Yeah. So, in fact, the policy that...
So Trump should be applauded for that, perhaps.
I think on that he probably is in the United States. I don't know about over here, but he's...
Does he deserve credit?
I mean, if you're measuring it like, here's my policy, actually, just so everybody understands, that was Obama's policy. Obama is the one that hammered that into place in 2014 with an agreement that all members of NATO would spend 2% of GDP on defense. And there were some that did that and some that didn't. And Trump really pushed that issue, I think, hard. And he did it, I think, knowing that he had a real structural advantage internationally within and with respect to Europe, and that it would not hurt him domestically in the United States. This is not an issue that hurts him politically. The idea that Europe
quite
should,
the opposite.
Right, that Europe should pay its fair share. We can discuss like what that, where the 2% figure comes and what a fair share means and so forth. But I think that's an issue that plays for him very well in the United States.
One more thing before we travel the world real quick. The final thing is very important because we have talked, and actually this series is part of that, the strongman, the new autocrats, and we've talked about Trump's preference for people like Putin, perhaps Erdogan, at least, the way they behave.
Yeah.
The past week, Trump sometimes is still able to shock the world, and one example was when he said that Saudi Arabia would not suffer any consequences from murdering the journalist Kamal Khashoggi in Turkey. Basically, he blamed the world. He said, the world is a vicious place. Right. These things happen. How bad is the signal that Trump gives to other leaders? Apparently, you can kill a journalist and get away with it.
Pretty bad, I think. When Donald Trump was running for office, he argued that, as we talked about briefly before, that the United States often was too aggressive in pushing its values overseas, spreading democracy, and I think there's something to that. I mean, the United States has made some real mistakes in doing that, whether you talk about Vietnam or Iraq or other places. And it's also been hypocritical and inconsistent in doing that.
He's also been on the record in favor of the Iraq war, even though he now denies it.
Right. But there's a flip side to this, and that is the United States not standing up for democratic values and for and opposing something like what the Saudi regime has been engaged in. If the United States is not prepared to stand up, who is? I mean, if the U.S. doesn't do it? And so my fear is the kind of language, the kind of relativistic language that he uses, and that, what matters most here are the arms sales and the balance of power, is that it creates, in a sense, almost a safe space for leaders to do this. It creates space for them to maneuver within.
I do wonder, though, if even though Obama's rhetoric would have been different, his words would have been different, but wouldn't, if Obama was still in office, in the end, Saudi Arabia still get the same arms deals, etc., etc.? Would it really be different, and isn't in a way, I know this sounds awful, but refreshing that Trump at least says what every president doesn't say but follows up to?
I'm not sure that I agree with the premise there. I think it would have been awfully difficult for Barack Obama to have turned a blind eye to this, and I think he also would have been much more susceptible to pressure from here,
Europe,
and Europe, and I don't mean here,
not
but
specifically,
but maybe, but Europe, and I think also his own party would have found it very hard to embrace that kind of, just very naked realpolitik. And look, you can see it even within his own party right now. So this is an issue where he's getting pushback now. So Lindsey Graham, who is really is a hawk and has aligned himself with Trump on so many issues, is pushing back and wants to investigate this in the Senate. This is not welcome news for Donald Trump. For all kinds of reasons, I suspect I think there is speculation that that Trump may be more deeply connected to the Saudi regime, and then people understand. I don't know that to be the case, but this is the kind of speculation, as you know, that's inside the Washington Beltway.
Whenever Lindsey Graham comes up, I have to remind people, this is the senator who, during the campaign, was running, one of the 17 running against Trump, and Trump gave out Lindsey Graham's mobile phone number to the crowd at a rally, saying everybody should call this senator and tell him he's an idiot. And now he's just a Trump ally.
He's like in the tank for him, but not on this issue.
No, I know, but it's great. He just started giving out phone numbers of senators. Anyway, let's go back to Asia, because but I guess the question is the same. Doesn't Trump also have a point when he says that specifically China is not, that trade between China and the US is not a level playing field? And isn't he right that he stands up to it? Chinese tariffs obviously are a lot higher than American tariffs.
Sure, he's got a point up to a point. Certainly many Americans are frustrated with China. People don't know this, but the United States has lost, over the last 15 years, millions of jobs to China. This is not, you don't have to listen to Donald Trump. Economists at MIT have documented this. A lot of jobs have left the United States and gone to China. And there are China practices, there are unfair trade practices. Before it was manipulating its currency, there are copyright issues and so forth. So it seems to me there's different ways to push back. Trump has taken, I think, kind of, a very tough stance, and one that has forced many Americans to pay a price. Actually, we're seeing this today. GM just announced that it's closing 7 production plants, 5 in North America. And one of the reasons is because of the tariffs, because of the cost of the parts has gone up.
40,000 jobs, I think.
Yes, this is big.
In Trump country,
this
right?
Is,
where he won.
Yeah, I just saw this before coming over here this evening, and that's a big story. And you can expect a tweet storm about other stuff that has nothing to do with this between now and tomorrow morning when you
and
wake
the end
up.
of this lecture, just to keep people away from the Michigan news.
From this issue.
Right.
But to go back to your point here, so there are other ways to do it, like, and I think putting down a marker was important. It was important for Obama to do it. It was, and I think Obama did it, but in a different way, which I'll mention in a second. And I think it was important for Trump to do it as well. What Obama did was he adopted a somewhat different strategy. So the push to create a Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, had an economic side to it, and a lot of people focused on, especially Democrats, for reasons that they were afraid it was going to lead to job loss and so forth. And I don't think Obama paid enough attention to that side of it. But there was a strategic dimension to it too. To essentially not contain China, but to create incentives for China to behave differently, to basically try to retether many countries, allies really of the United States in that region to the United States. In fact, if you really think about what Obama was doing, there was TPP on the one hand, and there was TTIP over here on the other. And I think really what the kind of grand strategy there was, leaving the economics aside, but just in a kind of geopolitical sense, was to reconnect regions that were historically very connected to the United States. At a time when it was very clear to the United States that China had made a move, and I'm sure this was covered when you did, the China Dream when the speaker was here, made a move with the Belt and Road Initiative to kind of expand across Eurasia. So I think there are other ways to kind of deal with this. What Trump has done, it seems to me, is by slapping essentially $250 billion in tariffs, right, is he has really ratcheted things up. And the goal is to disrupt the supply chains. That's what this is about.
Is this a game of chicken? I mean,
yeah, I think it's partly, and I think he's like wrestling with, or he's, he's dealing with somebody who's not going to find it very easy to back down politically inside China. And he's also dealing with, it's not like dealing with the Soviet Union, which was an economic pygmy compared to China.
Right. It's a powerhouse.
It's a powerhouse. And so these guys can hit back.
And this is also an election campaign, because the campaign for Trump's re-election has started after the midterms, basically has started now.
Yes.
I guess it's a permanent campaign.
Right.
His base loves this, so there's no reason for him to back down between now and 2020.
Yeah, so I think his base likes
Until
it,
they
except the
feel
soybean producers. They're not so
Right.
keen on this.
No, exactly.
So there are sectors that are, because China has been very clever about how they've targeted their response, and they've actually gone after Trump's coalition, to make sure that the tariffs hit kind of rural America. That's very kind of free trade oriented,
Indiana,
and has been in all
right.
those states. But I think the larger point that you're raising here is a very good one, that China is, and concerns about China are rather pervasive, I think, in the United States. I don't think it's like we're not at the point right now where it's like a fear of the Soviet Union and communism. We're not there. But if you think about the politics of this, basically you have a Republican Party that would like to invest more in the military to deal with China, and that's been its position for some time. The neocons had that position, and that's been a kind of bedrock position, I would say, for about 20 years. The Democrats have not been interested in that position, but they have been interested in getting tough on China economically. What Trump did was appropriate some of the Democratic language, essentially, in 2016.
Bernie Sanders.
Yes,
Right.
and others, and many Democrats have really not so much pushed trade protectionism, they call it fair trade, and kind of the poster child here is China. Because China is the one that has benefited so much the kind of prevailing narrative is at America's expense. So it's not too hard to imagine a politician in the United States that puts those two things together, that brings the military side of it and the economic side of it together in a way that bridges some of these differences between the Republicans and the Democrats. And this is pretty loaded stuff, because if this happens on the U.S. side, there's every reason to believe that there's going to be a reaction on the Chinese side. Because Xi Jinping is also playing differently than Donald Trump, but a nationalist card there as well.
But we're still talking about economic war, right?
Yeah, right now.
right?
Right now, right. But you know, I mean, a lot of people think that this thing could intensify on the economic front and then eventually kind of like spill over. I'm not predicting that. I'm saying I think we're playing with dynamite here, and so there's, you know, one might look for other ways to try to rebalance the relationship. I will say that, let's say Donald Trump doesn't last beyond 2020, or doesn't get reelected, and a Democrat gets elected. I think that the space that's been created here, it'd be very hard for a Democrat or a Republican to just roll this back. It's not going to happen.
And that's interesting, because not only does Trump's language, in that sense, resemble Bernie Sanders.
Right.
But also, if you look what Hillary Clinton said this week about Europe having to curb immigration,
Right.
the way she phrased that, and I don't remember her exact words, but she would not have said that 2 years ago. So are the Democrats moving towards a more civilized form of America first as well?
I don't think the Democrats, I mean, the problem is that there's a lot of stuff that's tied up in kind of America first, including white nationalism and racism and so forth. So, you know, I want to be really careful here, but I do think, I take the point, and I was also very struck by Clinton taking that position, that there's some rethinking that's going on in the Democratic Party about its own position on immigration, because they realize that some of their own base, remember, a lot of Democrats voted for Donald Trump. In fact, there were a lot of Democrats who once voted for Barack Obama and voted for Donald Trump that moved over. Believe that or not. I mean, it's true. And I think so they recognize, even within their own party, that they have people who are concerned about open borders. They're concerned about the implications for wages, for jobs, and the party has to think that problem through.
Right. But at the same time, among the new class of Democrats, those 40 seats that they gained during the midterms, there are many very progressives. The first Islamic female member of Congress, many young people, African Americans. So the Democrats have to fight that battle within their own party, right?
Indeed. So the Democrats have, I think it was Will Rogers, the great American comedian, many decades ago, who said, I don't belong to an organized party, I'm a Democrat. And I think that this is right, there's, in a sense, two wings inside the party. And for anybody to win on the Democratic side, they're going to have to find a way to bridge that. I wouldn't say it's like a deep divide, but nevertheless it exists. And
the kind of fight that the Republicans have already had.
Exactly.
In which Trump won.
And which, in a sense, Trump has won that, because now some of those Republicans are basically in play as independents or, never again Trumpers, and or never Trumpers.
When they leave office.
When they leave office, they're very vocal when they leave office. It's kind of like generals. But I think it's possible to imagine a leader inside the Democratic Party who could bridge that. I think actually the Democratic Party got a taste of it in the midterm elections. So there's a candidate who ran for Senate in Texas. I spent many years in Texas. I raised my kids in Texas. Granted, I was in a blue island in a red state. I was in Austin, Texas. But I know the state pretty well. A Democrat hasn't been elected senator in that state, or hasn't held a Senate seat since 1994. It's very Republican. And there's a young guy named Beto O'Rourke, who is from El Paso and is a congressman. And he mounted a challenge against Ted Cruz, who's the sitting senator there. And he came within a whisker of winning that race. And he might have actually won that race if the Green Party candidate had stepped down and withdrawn. Progressives often commit fratricide, and I'm afraid this was maybe a case.
And he got 80,000 people in the stadium.
And he raised
a rock star.
He raised more money than any candidate ever running for office. And if you ever get a chance to watch this guy on a video, it is impressive. And there's already, if he had won, you would be asking me, so what about Beto O'Rourke? Is he the guy that will pull the party together? But I think he's
being mentioned for
he's already being mentioned. He's already being mentioned.
Which probably means you're out of the game if you're being
this early.
Right.
So because a candidate is probably somebody that we're not thinking and talking about right now. But it will have to be somebody that can simultaneously speak to, I think, kind of progressive and especially younger voters, that is capable of reaching out to what we call in the U.S. identity voters, but not being trapped by that, but still speaking to blue-collar, lunch-pail kind of voters and, kind of white male, people that look like me, that can speak to those voters as well. And it's just not everybody can't, it takes a very special leader to be able to do that. And right now that there's 20 people who want to run for the Democratic nomination, and I'm not convinced that person's there right now.
Right.
Yeah. So.
Very interesting. So we're from Asia, we went to Texas, and now we go back to the Middle East. But it's all very interesting and important. About the Middle East, if everything Trump is doing, from moving the embassy to Jerusalem, from his stance towards Saudi Arabia, etc., Iran seems to be, and you mentioned it, the key word, right? Is every step Trump takes in the Middle East, is that driven by Iran and then Israel on the other side?
About every step, but a lot of the steps, I think are driven by this view that Iran is the main challenge in the region, and that the United States has to, and the West more generally, but the United States has to put together a coalition, an alliance against it. And I think this administration came into office thinking that it could bring Saudi Arabia and Israel and others together to form, that they had, granted, a marriage of convenience, but nevertheless that they could be brought together over this issue. And in a sense, it was suppressing the Israeli-Palestine issue and elevating this other kind of cleavage inside the region. And I think that they're still moving in this direction. I think it's the kind of dominant theme, and one could argue, I don't think Trump has not said this, but he could have made the argument that we have, larger strategic ambitions. These are the ambitions. He focused more on the arms sales, and we have jobs, and there's profits here, and so forth, and explaining the U.S. position with respect to Khashoggi, but the murder. But yeah, I think that Iran is front and center for him.
So then, if on the one hand Trump doesn't want to fight big, expensive wars anymore, on the other hand he teared up the Iran Accord. He hired John Bolton, an Iran hawk, and Trump also knows, or I'm sure his advisors have told him, that wars win elections. The Iraq War, it was a quagmire, it was horrible, but George Bush won his re-election in 2004 partly because America doesn't want to let down a president waging a war. Right. Is there a chance that Trump goes to war?
Yeah, I think there's a chance that
a reasonable chance.
Yeah, and you can imagine that the economy by 2020 is not what it is today, right? No. And a lot of economists expect, or they see, this GM story. So one of the arguments that's out there is GM sees where the economy is going and is preparing for it.
The factories that you mentioned.
Yes, right, closing down the factories. They deny that and so forth, but I'm just, it's already out there as soon as the story appeared. And so I think that
So he needs something else to focus.
Yeah, so
attention on.
well, this goes back to my point before. If he doesn't have a play domestically, if he's kind of blocked domestically, and you have gridlock domestically, he's going to do what presidents do. They have much more running room and discretionary authority internationally. Mm-hmm. Yes, the Senate has to, if there's a treaty, the Senate has to ratify it, but the presidents can go off, not exactly half-cocked, but they can do a lot, and actually a lot of damage before there's like congressional hearings and discussion and so forth.
But
so
both houses of Congress do need to go along with military action.
Not in the short term. If there's an emergency,
right,
they can act, but eventually they would have to. But I think what I think is there's a lot of things short of going to war. You can saber rattle. You can, as we saw, move the military to the southern border to deal with the caravan, right? The people moving up, right? There's and there are less risky places. It seems to me. Let's just. I'm not saying I want to make this clear. Trump so far has shown very little proclivity to use military force. Right. He's done what they said back in the 1990s when Clinton shot off cruise missiles. They called them pinpricks. That's basically what he's done in Syria. So this is not a guy that he doesn't come across as trigger happy, and he doesn't really trust the military. I think that's pretty clear.
So a president not trusting his own military is now comforting.
I know what I mean is I think he's very
Right.
he sees the use of military force as a potential problem if he were to get sucked in, if the country were to get sucked into to a larger war. And that goes to the problem of Iran, because hitting Iran, it can be like you can get sucked into something much larger. There might be another country or another place to use military force or to engage in saber rattling, or where he could do that. Or it could be that Trump relies on economic means to kind of raise the temperature, if you will. And I mean, because what you're talking about is diverting public attention. Right. And there's just a bunch of different ways to do it. But I think there are some people that think that the probability that the United States uses military force over the next 2 years went up as a result of the midterms.
Let's spend a few minutes talking about Europe before then we go to the audience questions. It seems that on the one hand, when Trump towards Europe, Trump and the tweets and whatever he says about Macron, etc., that's one thing. Then on the other hand, you have American policy towards Europe, and that seems to be pretty standard, traditional, and not as upsetting as we may expect if you just look at the tweets. Would you agree? Is there, or am I underestimating the damage he has really done to the Atlantic relation?
I think he's done a fair amount of political damage. And I think that it's possible for it to be repaired. I think most of the damage is at the level of confidence in America's commitments, its reliability. A kind of more uncertainty about where the United States is. Is the United States in retreat? Is the United States focused on some other region? Can the President of the United States be counted on in crunch time to be there? Mm-hmm. And I think probably the sense is that this is, it would have to be a process. But I think what it's raised is, are we looking at something? I mean, this is a question I think about a lot, and I don't have the answer. So but maybe one of you will. Has something been started that will be very hard to kind of turn back? So there's a lot of people.
Even when he's out of office.
Yes, I said there's people who think that when Donald Trump leaves, that everything will snap back. I don't believe that.
What will stay?
So I think the question is whether or not political leaders in the United States, for example, now find that in fact they should continue to push Europe to do more for itself, that take more responsibility for its own defense, which
as being discussed right now.
Yeah, as being discussed, but
Army,
but that the space is kind of opened up now in a way that it wasn't really before. And I think the same with international institutions. I mean, it's not hard for me to imagine that if a Democrat comes in, the Democrat is going to push pretty hard on climate and want to do something on that. But I think that in raising questions about international institutions and the value of kind of global governance for the United States, I think this is kind of it's caught people's attention and political leaders' attention in the U.S. And I don't think there's just going to be like a snapback to multilateralism. I mean, Barack Obama made international partnership a kind of signature feature of his foreign policy, and I think it's one of the reasons he was beloved in so many other parts of the world. But
why he maybe was not as beloved by many Americans.
Exactly, and I think that the needle has moved a little bit here, and so I think some of the question is how much of this has to do with Donald Trump and how much of this has to do with the United States. That there are just deeper structural changes that he somehow put his finger on, and in his kind of erratic way has represented, and not in the most effective way, perhaps, but he's opened up, in a sense, a political space that wasn't there before.
Would you say that what we're witnessing, or is that too strong? What we're witnessing is an end to the liberal order as we've known it since the war, with Europe and America being the two pillars?
I'm not willing to go that far, especially because this is being videoed, but...
Is it really? I didn't...
Yeah, right.
Then I take a few things back as well.
So what I will say is he sure as hell has rattled the cage. He has upset and disrupted things in a way that I don't think we imagined was really possible. Perhaps we were too complacent, but I'm not, prepared to go that like Europe and the United States are going their separate ways. But I do think that it means that there will be a lot more negotiating, and that things that were taken for granted before won't necessarily be taken granted in the future, on this side as well as on the other side. Because if you have a president that comes in and can just kind of like throw it seems like he's almost like throwing the apple cart over, right? Then, I mean, who's to say the next one won't do something, she won't do something completely different?
Mm-hmm. Final question before we go to audience question. We haven't talked about Russia much. One question on that, but then focusing on domestic politics. I know you keep a close track of the Russia investigation, because everybody who's interested in American politics does. The Mueller report on collusion or possible collusion, it can be there tonight as we speak, or maybe it takes 3 more months. Mm-hmm. What are your expectations of the damage to the Trump administration? Or would it be pure speculation, because we don't know yet what he has?
It's definitely pure speculation.
We like that.
Yeah, because we don't know. The guy has run an unbelievably tight ship, as you know.
No leaks.
No leaks. And he seems to be the type of investigator that wants to make sure that every I is dotted and every T is crossed. And I think that's wise. Here, because this thing has to be pretty tight and pretty compelling. I would be surprised at the end of this if it's not fairly damaging. I think the question for people is, kind of how close does this get to Donald Trump? And I don't know the answer to that. But I think, there seems to have been enough kind of further down that I would be surprised if this doesn't open avenues of additional investigation. And I think that's the way you have to think about it. I don't think this will be like the final word. So even if Mueller's report is trashed by Donald Trump, and even if Trump himself is somehow kind of hived off and treated differently, I suspect that there will be a lot of opportunity for Democrats in the Congress to investigate. And so, I mean, I think that this is going to be going on for the next 2 years. I don't think, let me just push this, I don't think whatever the report says, I mean, it would have to be just unbelievably damning for the Democrats to move to impeachment. I do not think, and Pelosi actually went on record right after the election saying they would not do that. And I think partly they have in the back of their minds what happened back during the Clinton years when the Republicans did impeach, the House impeached Clinton. You know, the way it works in the United States, the House of Representatives moves first and it can impeach a president, but then there's a trial in the Senate and you need 2/3 of the Senate to convict. There's no way that conviction is going to happen because there's too many Republicans in there. But in any event, what Pelosi has basically said is this is off the table, partly because they know how it hurt Republicans back during the Clinton years. It boomeranged and really hurt them. But also I think they learned something from their own behavior during the midterms. So one of the things people don't know about how the Democrats, just briefly on this, how the Democrats ran their midterm campaigns. They didn't campaign against Donald Trump. There were no TV ads, or okay, there were a few. But not many TV ads about Donald Trump. Those TV ads were about health care. And the single most important issue in the campaign was health care and what was happening to it. Over 40% of Americans identified that. More important than the economy, more important than immigration. That was the issue. That's what Democrats ran on. So what they realize is they need to stick close to the issues. That doesn't mean you can't investigate Trump up the wazoo, and they will.
Thank you so much. That was great.